Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Tasini.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. Good morning, Sarasota. Yeah. And do you feel the burn?
Yeah!
Come on, Sarasota, you're better than that. Do you feel the burn?
Yeah!
Hey, now we're talking. We got to get some excitement and energy around this political revolution. So it's really quite an honor and a privilege to be here with you. It's an honor and a privilege to be in this political revolution with you. It's an honor and privilege to try to represent the man who will be elected the next president of the United States, Bernie Sanders. Everywhere I go, I can feel that energy. And part of that energy comes from the people like you, the volunteers who are making this campaign work. The truth is that we are lucky as members of this political revolution to have an amazing, amazing staff that Bernie has. 170 people on the ground in Iowa, many people in New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina. He's opening now offices you probably read in the Super Tuesday states in March. But the fact is that political revolutions, movements, cannot be done just by staff people. That's just a fact of numbers. You can't create movements without the kind of people here in this audience, the kind of people that I've met all across the country as I've traveled. So actually, an applause to yourselves. Give yourselves a round of applause for the activity you've done. And I do want to recognize the people who particularly have worked on this event and bringing me to Florida. Tom Walker, who you heard from the Nations Group. Lynn, who just introduced me from the Sarasota Manatee for Bernie organization group. David Beaton, who's doing the sound, and Bill and Teresa Ellison over here who are doing the video, and I thank you for that. Is it Mike or Mika? Mika. Martinelli and Bruce Glassberg. Erica Brigham, who's doing the merchandise. Mike Schlasko, who's doing voter reg. And as Lynn pointed out, you need to register as a Democrat, and you need to tell all your friends that if they want to vote for Bernie, they need to register as a Democrat. And last but not least, and you're standing way in the back, but could you just come on, take a few steps up here, come so that we can actually see Arlene. Arlene Sweeting, who has been just really, I know you know her. You know her. I've met her mostly through email. This is the first time we've met face-to-face. But, you know, Arlene and all the people I mentioned, it really is a testament to Bernie and to you that people like you are involved in this campaign. You know, I traveled, I think the first journey I did was to South Carolina. And I met a guy named Sean over Facebook, over the internet. Had never met him before. And without knowing this guy and having any background of friendship, he organized a whole team of people to shepherd me around South Carolina and help me sell these books and advocate for Bernie. And I could tell you dozens of stories like that. And so one of the things that excites me is being in this campaign and to say to you, the volunteers who perhaps have been involved for the first time, how many people have been involved in this campaign? It's your first campaign. Raise your hands. Okay, that's great. And welcome to people who are involved in a political campaign for the first time, because every political campaign that I've been in, and I've been in a lot, you make friends that you will never, ever forget your entire lifetime. You will have experiences that you will have, moments of sometimes challenges, but also wonderful moments. And one of those wonderful moments will be on January 20th, 2017, when Bernie Sanders is inaugurated the next president of the United States. And I'm confident he's going to win. And we're going to talk about that. I'm not just giving like rhetoric. There's some actual concrete things that are happening that I think say that he's going to win Iowa, he's going to win New Hampshire, and then the dam is going to burst. We are going to win. This is sort of Bernie 101. And what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the themes of the campaign, but also talk about some very concrete things about Bernie's positions and how we can maybe talk about them and view them. And it's mainly to help you and suggest some things that will be useful to you when you go out and do the phone banking, when you're walking the streets and petitioning for Bernie, when you're talking to your neighbors, trying to convince them to join our revolution. The book I wrote was, as Lynn pointed out quite well, it was really a handbook. I thought of it as an organizer. What could I give to people that would help them make the case for the political revolution and for Bernie? And so it is 95% Bernie's words. As an author, I had to get out of the way and figure out how to do in a very slim volume, how to hand people the tools to say, here's what Bernie stands for, and here's what he stood for his entire adult life. Man never does poll testing, unlike other candidates that we may know. He's been solid on his principles for 30 and 40 years. So why are we all here today? Something has touched us in politics. Now, I'm from New York, little island called Manhattan, and, I said Manhattan. I know I should be surprised that I'm here and there are some ex-New Yorkers here, but the truth is that when we come together, there are some differences we have because of the communities we live in. But there's two things that we share, no matter where we live, when we come together in this political revolution. And the first thing is that we're Democrats. Most of us are Democrats. We've either been Democrats for a long time or we've come back into the Democratic Party because of this movement. And as Democrats, there are certain principles that we believe in, but we also, and I'll speak for myself, but I think in traveling around the country, I see this as a theme. We're frustrated with the party, and we know that the party can be much better. We don't want our party controlled by corporate lobbyists. We don't want our party to support bad trade agreements that destroy good jobs in America. We don't want our party to be supporting immoral wars that kill hundreds of thousands of people. And we want our party to stand for wise spending, economic wisdom that grows our society and makes the right investments in our society. And the second thing that I think we share is that we understand that there has to be radical change in this country. And when I mean radical change, some people think, wow, radical change. I'm talking about things that Bernie talks about, which are pretty, very, very simple. Make a lot of sense. And we're going to talk about that now in our Bernie 101. But I want to start, and if you don't remember anything that I say today on the different subject matters, this is the most important thing to remember. That this whole campaign, and this is what I say to the media and anywhere I travel, you can boil it down to a very simple contrast. It's the political revolution versus the status quo. What we want is fundamental revolution in the country that changes the economy, changes our society in ways that treats people humanely, and we are fed up with the status quo, and we intend to kick the status quo to the curb. And the only person representing a political revolution in both parties is Bernie Sanders. The second thing that, to my left, that when you accept the fact and agree with the notion that we are trying to create a political revolution, Bernie's ideas, his principles, the things that we have come together and joined together to push forward can be really boiled down to three simple ideas. The first one is that everything he talks about, everything that we cherish, is about moral principles. Because when you think about a topic, let's say healthcare, or jobs, or climate change, you process it as a human being in two ways. There are facts behind that, which we're going to talk about, but there's also something deep that touches you. You may not actually explicitly say it, but behind something that you want is a deep moral principle that you've held for probably your whole adult life, or maybe you found it in the last 10 years, but it is what is grounding the feelings we have about policy. And so everything that Bernie has, everything he says, is about a moral principle. And you know, when I say that, I actually see his face and him speaking. And the one thing I want to say to you who have not had a chance to meet him personally is part of what motivates this man, and part of why I'm obviously an unabashed fan, and I've never met anybody in my political life like him. And I've met hundreds, if not thousands, of politicians. Some of them are good ones. But he is the same person when he speaks to 20,000 people in a big arena as he would be if he was sitting right next to you in that chair and talking one-on-one. And I think that speaks to the kind of moral principles that a man has, or a woman, but a person. That they don't change. They're not trying to adjust and make you feel better. It's the same person. And I think that that is what has captivated America. That is why when they have, just the other day, the field director from Iowa told me, they had a place reserved for 200 people in Iowa. 600 people came out. That's happening all over Iowa. We are going to win Iowa. We are going to win Iowa. The second idea behind every single thing that we're campaigning for is shared responsibility. Now, oftentimes, people talk about this as shared sacrifice. And just from my point of view, I don't think that when you're talking about investing in healthcare and free education, that that's a sacrifice. That's something that we have as a society to have shared responsibility to make these things happen. So everything that Bernie is campaigning on, that we are campaigning on, to create this political revolution is about shared responsibility. And the third thing, which is really important, as someone who has written about economics for a long time, one of the things I love about all Bernie's proposals and all the proposals that we are advocating for is that there's really good economic wisdom behind every single one of them. You love the rhetoric, and you feel that tingle, or I do. Every time I hear Bernie, and I've heard him hundreds of times, I still feel moved. But once you get past the excitement and the tingle, there's actual economic wisdom in every single thing we're proposing to make a better society and make the economy function better for human beings. So what I want to do is I want to go through a few of these and suggest some ideas and ways of thinking about these issues. And cleverly, I think, I've color-coded them. So if you look up at the different issues, foreign affairs, healthcare, jobs, civil rights, climate change, and education, you will see that each one has a blue, which talks about a moral principle. Each one has a, depending on what colors you see through your own eyes, I call this orange. You see the notion of shared responsibility. And the final piece, which is in green, is economic wisdom. So let's start on the far right, which is jobs, which we all care about, no matter where we live. And it's a very simple principle. Every person should be able to earn a living wage at a job where she or he is treated with dignity and respect. And I particularly emphasize, that's worth applauding, I particularly emphasize union. Now, I'm a proud member of organized labor. I have been for many years because it is the labor movement that built the middle class and built America. And we've forgotten about that, and we don't teach that in history. Kids don't live it, but that's a fact. It's an economic fact. And actually, you can look at the decline in wages over the last 30 years, and it's almost an exact same line that merges with the decline of unions. That's just not, it's not a happenstance. There's a direct connection. And I believe that if we want to get to what this beautiful principle says, we have to have a big, vibrant, powerful, organized labor movement of men and women who stand together to demand justice in the workplace. Now, the shared responsibility part of that is kind of simple too. The first two are about asking the 1% or the one-tenth of 1% to pay their fair share and not to keep gobbling up everything and seem like they have to stuff more money in their pockets because, you know what? Everybody needs a third yacht. And everybody needs the fifth house in the south of France or the expensive bottle of wine. We need to say no. There's a limit to that, and Bernie says that so passionately. And so we want, part of shared responsibility actually is that in the workplace, in a factory, the CEO should not get the lion's share of the money. We have to push those wages down. The corporate stock gambling casino is what I call it. There has to be this shared responsibility that we don't allow corporations, and this is what they do, to manipulate their stock, to fatten up their profits, partly to pay CEOs more money, at the expense of everyone else. Not just the workers in that particular company, but in the communities that are surrounding that. Because when a company does that, and just engages in this fraud, which is what it was, particularly around the recent economic collapse, that affects communities beyond the workers and beyond the walls of the factory or the workplace. It's the mom and pop store down the street that doesn't sell lunches anymore because workers got laid off because of the greed of some CEO. And you can just make all those connections. And the positive thing about shared responsibility is we're going to raise wages. And Bernie has been very clear, and this is one of the most exciting things to me in the job area, we're going to push to get the minimum wage up to $15 an hour. Now, it's just a fact that people cannot survive on the minimum wage today. And I want to share with you just on that, because people are going to ask you this. I know it's going to come up when you say we're for $15 an hour minimum wage. I want to share with you the wisdom of a 16-year-old girl who I met in Anamosa, Iowa, which is a small town in Iowa. The last trip in Iowa, I drove 1,000 miles in about 3 days for Bernie, going to all sorts of small towns. One of my goals and roles is to get to places that Bernie can't always get to, just because he's only one human being and he's only one man. So I did a little round table with some high school students, and we talked about the minimum wage, $15 an hour minimum wage. And this young woman, 16-year-old, was a little unsure. Then she got enough courage up to raise her hand, and she asked a question about the $15 minimum wage. And she said the following two things. Well, number one, isn't that just a starter job for people like me, young people? Those retail jobs, you know, the jobs that people work for minimum wage. And the second thing she said, how is everybody going to be able to afford that? People tell me that if you raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, businesses are going to close. There's going to be this tremendous, terrible thing that's going to happen. So the way I answered it, and this is going to come up, I'm sure it's going to come up in phone calls, people are going to raise this with you, is the first thing is, it's just false, just on the facts, to say that these are starter jobs. Just the data show that huge numbers of people working for minimum wage jobs are in their 20s, in their 30s, they're adults with families, they're older people, meaning in their 40s and 50s. A lot of people who had those great industrial union jobs, who lost them because of these bad trade agreements that Bill Clinton started by passing NAFTA, a lot of those people end up in minimum wage jobs. They're not teenagers. And the second thing I said to her is, why do we accept the idea that a teenager should work for a poverty level wage? Why shouldn't we pay someone for the work they do, regardless of how old they are? Why shouldn't a teenager be able to come home with money in his or her pocket and say, you know, I don't have to go to my mom to get the money to go to the movies or to fill up my car with gas. I can do that on my own. And this is not just fantasy. I lived in Australia for 2 years where the minimum wage is $16, $17 an hour. They also have free health care there. And they have a guaranteed pension for every full-time employee. And somehow that country is doing pretty well. Actually, waiters there, tipping, if anybody's been to Australia, tipping is not a big deal in Australia. You don't have to tip because waiters actually make a living wage, meaning they can actually pay their bills. They're not going to become rich, but they can actually make a living wage. And I could see this kind of, enlightenment. This 16-year-old had heard this for the first time. Now, she did say something that's important to recognize. She said, well, but costs are going to go up. We're going to have to pay more. And I said, that's right. We will. We're going to have to pay more for our Big Macs or whatever else we buy in the stores that have people working for $15 an hour wages. But then she said, but I'll be making more money. Now, simple logic like that is beautiful coming from a 16-year-old. And I think that's our argument to people. We want a $15 an hour minimum wage because it's just and it's economically smart. We're going to put more money in people's pockets, and they're going to be able to spend that in the economy. So that's the beautiful thing about that argument and that movement to a higher wage. Now, I want to go to education. I see some younger people than me in the audience. We're all young, including Jim? Joe. Going to be 103 years old this week. And Joe is here to be part of this political revolution. Good to have you. But there are some people here, I'll bet you have college debt. Is there anybody here who has a college debt, right? I can see hands going up. I met somebody in the Sanders campaign who's a lawyer, and she kind of gave up her life as a lawyer to work for Bernie in New Hampshire. Left college. This blew me away. Now, I've heard of big numbers before. With $500,000 in college debt to go up through law school. $500,000. Now, that's completely insane. And one of the great principles we're arguing for is that every person who wants to expand their mind and enhance job options should have that right. Very simple moral principle. And the way we're going to pay for it, and you've heard this before, is back to shared responsibility. Again, the way Bernie puts it so well, when Wall Street, well, he doesn't say it the following way, I'm going to say it. When Wall Street screwed the economy, he says it a little bit more delicately, and they came to all of us for a bailout. They demanded money. Our government gave it to them. Now it's time for Wall Street to support the middle class and give back the middle class. And the way we're going to do that is through what's called the financial transactions tax. Now, Bernie didn't just draw this out of the thin air. It's been around for a very long time. It's called a Tobin tax, created by a guy named James Tobin. It's very, very simple. You put a little tiny tax on all this financial speculation that happens, all sorts of trading. It would never hurt small investors that are doing things on their little accounts. What it would touch, and where you would raise a lot of money, is from the big hedge funds and the people who move millions of shares just by flipping a computer switch. And you could raise enough money to pay for college for every single person. Now, what's the economic wisdom in this? Again, because we're logical people, we nod our heads and say, well, yeah, this makes sense. But here's what it is. Right now, we have about $1.2 trillion in college debt. And one of the things I actually learned in doing some research about this, it's actually held mostly by people in their 30s and 40s, not necessarily people in their 20s. Part of that is, when you get out of college, you have a little time before you have to start paying it off. But the huge amount of debt is people in their 30s and 40s. The very people who are trying to start families, who want to buy a small first home, who want to buy a car, who maybe want to put a little money aside for retirement. That money is held, that debt is held by them, which is a huge burden. Now think of what we would do if that debt didn't exist for the economy. All that $1.2 trillion, or a huge piece of it, would flow into economic activity, not being given to rip-off banks who are charging high interest rates to people, unimaginable interest rates. And by the way, part of what Bernie wants to do in this proposal, it's not just future-looking in terms of people going to college in the future. He wants to use some of the money to lower the interest rates for people who currently hold college debt. Because now, as you know, interest rates are at historic lows, even as the Fed is trying to crazily raise interest rates. But people are paying 7, 8, 9, 10% on their college loans, which is insane. So part of what Bernie's proposal will do is lower those payments for people right now. So it'll have an immediate effect on those people who hold debt. Now, when you go out to audiences, and you probably know that a lot of the big rallies are overwhelmingly younger people. Just they're flocking to Bernie like crazy. And when someone says, well, Bernie, you're a democratic socialist. You know, oh my God, democratic socialist. If you say to a young person, yeah, I'm a democratic socialist, I'm for free tuition if you want to go to college. Now, most young people will never have heard or remember the democratic socialist. What they will remember is that this man wants to make sure I can go to college for free, tuition free, and leave college and have a secure life. That's one of the reasons that many young people think this man has some sanity behind him. He knows how to solve one of the great, great burdens that young people are facing. Let me go to, Let me go to foreign affairs, and then I'm actually going to, as you can see with civil rights and climate change, there are some very important principles too. I want to kind of get to questions, but I do want to address foreign affairs and healthcare. So one of the things that I've been talking a lot about in this campaign and trying to counter, particularly the media spin, is that somehow Bernie does not have as much foreign policy experience as the candidate of the status quo. The candidate of the status quo had a title and flew around the world for many, many years, and, as you know, was an elected senator and sat in the Senate and heard lots of stuff about foreign affairs. And so the media in particular says, well, the candidate of the status quo has this enormous amount of foreign policy experience, and Bernie doesn't. And the two things I think we have to remember, and I'm just going to jump down to the green part. Number one was the Iraq War. Now, if you have not seen it, or maybe have not viewed it recently, go to YouTube. Man, YouTube saves us from everything, because things exist forever. And you can always tell the people, look it up. Go to YouTube. Watch Bernie's speech in 2002 on the House floor. He was then a member of the House, when he talked about his opposition to the Iraq War. Every single thing he said came to pass. Every single thing. He said, look, Saddam Hussein is a brutal, horrendous dictator. No one should stand up for him. But how many men and women are going to lose their lives for this immoral war? And one of the great things about Bernie is that he didn't just say Americans, he said Iraqis. He said, how many innocent people are going to die in this war? What is it going to cost us? The Iraq war to date has cost us somewhere around $3 trillion. That's all of us, meaning taxpayers. And counting. Because all those people who served in the military, who have come back with horrible wounds, some visible and some not so visible, those are people we're going to have to care for the rest of their lives. $3 trillion. And he said, what happens if you fracture Iraq? You get rid of Saddam Hussein. What happens then? And while he didn't use the name, he essentially forecast the rise of ISIS, the thing that everybody's talking about now. He knew that if you destroyed Iraq, if you created this war where you fractured a country that has so much civil unrest and ethnic tensions, something would come in its place that would be potentially far worse. And what Bernie says is, I did not trust George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld. Is there any Democrat here that did? Please raise your hand if you trusted George Bush, Dick Cheney, or Donald Rumsfeld. Hillary Clinton did. The candidate of the status quo believed those three people, voted for that immoral war, and as a result of that immoral war, hundreds of thousands of people died. We have spent an enormous amount of money that should have been spent on all the list of things we support. And now we're dealing with ISIS. So when I say this to the media, I say, now who should we trust then in the White House? Who should we trust then to make those decisions? Bernie Sanders or the candidate of the status quo, based on that one vote, which in my view was the most consequential foreign policy vote in the last 15 to 20 years, and a disaster. And the reason Bernie understood that is because of this: moral principles. Bernie was not trying to get career advantage. Bernie stood there and made an analysis based on his moral principles over the last 30 or 40 years. And the second piece, which is related to that, I don't know how many people caught this. In the second debate, there was a moment that really got no coverage by the traditional media because they don't read, they don't think about history. I have never seen, ever, a national candidate, a presidential candidate, stand on the stage and list the foreign policy disasters that the United States created. And there was a moment in that debate, I would almost like to read that if I had it now, where he talked about Chile, Guatemala, Iran, and all the involvement that the U.S. had. And he did not say it in a harsh way, but he did it in a factual way. And the consequences of the involvement, the coups, the CIA coups in Guatemala, the CIA coup in Iran that removed a democratically elected head of the country, gave rise to the Shah, which then gave rise to the Islamic Revolution. And so you could see when that man was talking about that, he could synthesize and understand where we had made mistakes, why we cannot be the military cop of the world, why we should not intervene in these kinds of conflicts. And they're based on moral principles and understanding of history. And that, I would submit, is the kind of man we need in the White House. Now, I want to close, and then I'll be happy to take questions. I want to close on healthcare, because healthcare makes a broader point that you're going to confront when you talk to voters. So you probably have heard a lot of people in the media say, oh, Bernie Sanders, you've got all these great programs. How are you going to pay for them? Even though he's very explicit how he's going to pay for free college tuition by asking Wall Street to pay for it. And they start throwing around numbers. And one number that got thrown around was by the Wall Street Journal. Right. But it was regurgitated and used a million times. $18 trillion. Now, what I've found, particularly in media people who actually don't read, don't understand the economy, and just regurgitate junk repeatedly, that when you use big numbers, they're very impressed. So if you said $18 trillion to most people, say, holy cow, that's a lot of money. $18 trillion over 10 years, even though the economy is probably going to grow in total by a total of $250 trillion overall over 10 years. So when you start putting those things in context, it doesn't seem like a lot of money. But let's say this is $18 trillion. This represents, my little ping pong balls represent $18 trillion. I'm going to take out just a little handful. In this bucket is roughly $3 trillion. And that accounts for every single thing that Bernie's suggesting over the long haul. That includes free tuition, the infrastructure program he wants to do, $1 trillion over 5 years to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure and create good jobs. $3 trillion. Everything else is healthcare. And I want you to remember this because it's a visual thing so that when you talk to people, you explain to them that he's paid for everything. But to understand where the money is, you have to say the small amount of it, the total amount of all he wants to do is this little teensy bit. It's all about healthcare. Now, we are the only industrialized, advanced country in the world that does not have single-payer Medicare for all, which is completely insane. I mentioned that I lived in Australia for a while where they have essentially free healthcare from cradle to grave. And Bernie is very clear. He wants to enact, and he's been for this ever since he's been in the Congress, going back to the House. Every person should have as a right, from cradle to grave, affordable, comprehensive health care. Period. Every person, no matter who they are. And there's a lot of morality that we can debate about that. That's sort of almost obvious, but I want us to focus on the economic wisdom part of it. Because right now, every year we're spending $3 trillion on healthcare. Mostly because of outrageous CEO salaries in the insurance industries, the corrupt drug companies that are charging people immoral prices for drugs, and the duplication of having all these insurance companies that do the same thing. Now, Medicare, which needs to be fixed and adjusted, we've got to make it better, operates at roughly 2 to 3% administrative costs. And in the private insurance company, I call it the private insurance criminal industry, it's roughly between 15 and 25%, depending on which study you look at. Now, that is completely insane from an economic standpoint. We spend 15% of our GDP on health care. Now, with all due respect to the current president, who has done some good things, his health care plan does not solve that.
No.
As Bernie says on the campaign trail many times, he always says, I like President Obama. I think he wants to do good for the country. And his health care plan did cover a lot of people. But hey, I'm covered under that. My health care premiums are going up again. One of the companies collapsed, and I just had to find another health care plan because I have to pay for the premiums myself. I'm like many Americans. And so President Obama's health care plan does not solve our health care crisis. And in fact, you know why the insurance industry spent billions, maybe it was millions of dollars to promote the Affordable Care Act? It's because the Affordable Care Act was bringing them millions of new customers. Now, if you go back to the healthcare debate in the other Clinton administration, one of the things that the status quo candidate says, well, I have the scars from the healthcare debate, as if to say to the American people, I know how to do this, and I know how to deal with the healthcare crisis. Well, that's completely false, because worse than the Affordable Care Act, the debacle during the Clinton administration, led by the status quo candidate, never ever took on the very structure of the industry in terms of letting the insurance companies and the drug companies continue to rip off millions of Americans. And so when people say, oh, and you hear this, oh, the status quo candidate has experience in healthcare. Yes, there is experience. It's not the experience we need. It's not the experience that will save millions of Americans from bankruptcy and from losing and spending tens of thousands of dollars out of their pocket to just try to stay healthy. The only way to do that is Medicare for all. The only way to do that is Medicare for all. Let me wrap up and say now something about you.
About civil rights.
I wanted to just collapse them. A lot of times when we're in campaigns, if you look at campaigns historically, a lot of people look at how difficult they are. And particularly, I would say younger people don't believe you can make that change. And I understand why, because politics has become so corrupt. The billionaires own the process. But the reason we're going to win this campaign, the reason we're going to win in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and all these other places is because of the involvement of people like you. And the way we need to bring other people in is to recognize the victories we've had. If you had told me 10 years ago that I would live to see the day that there would be an African American elected president of the United States, I would say, what are you smoking? You've got to be kidding. No way that's going to happen. If you had told me 5 years ago that it would be the law of the land, that anybody can marry anyone they want, anyone they love, I would have said, no way, that's not going to happen. If you had told me that the $15 an hour minimum wage campaign would be essentially on everyone's lips and change the conversation in America so that top political people have to address it, I would not have believed it. And if you had told me that the status quo candidate is falsely saying that she opposes the Trans-Pacific Partnership, one of the worst trade agreements we had, it's like NAFTA light, I would have said, no way that's going to happen. Now, all of that happened because of you. Because people took to the streets. People made phone calls. People talked to their neighbors. People gave up of their time. And so what I'm urging you to do, because this is what I am at heart as an organizer, is to understand that this is an election that is the most important one in our lifetime because it's an opportunity. Every single election, people say, you've heard this. This is the most important election in our lifetime, right? We hear that every cycle. And I've always believed that every single election is important. Just think of what would have happened if the Supreme Court had not handed the White House to George W. Bush. How many people would be alive today? Right? How much money we would have saved. Every single election is important. But the difference in this election is that this is an opportunity election. An opportunity that may not come back to us. We have a man named Bernie Sanders, and I get emotional talking about this, who is putting his life on hold and going out there all across the country to bring to us a political revolution. If we don't have his back, that's our failure. We have his back, and the reason we're about to win is because people have worked really, really hard. We've raised $74 million. Now, when he first started running, I had no doubt that he could win the election on the issues and who he was and where people were at. I didn't know whether we could raise the money. I've seen insurgent candidates try to rub two nickels together to try to fund that staff person that they want to send. You, the people here, and all across the country have made this possible through small donations. 1 million people. And now he can go on in March in Super Tuesday and have TV advertisements in all those 11 and 12 states. You made that happen. So what we need to do between now and the Democratic Convention, but certainly between now and March 1st, is we need to work even harder. I've put my life on hold. I'm going to Iowa, New Hampshire for free, right through the New Hampshire primary. And I'm going to go to every small town. I'm going to talk to as many people as possible. You can do similar things. If you gave 1 hour, give 2 hours. If you've had 1 day that you've devoted to Bernie, think about giving an extra day. If you gave $10, think about giving $20. Push. Each of us has to push ourselves a little harder because this is an election of opportunity. We can have the political revolution, and we can make this work. Thank you very much.